When I was a brand new baby philosopher, my very first introduction to philosophy course a long time ago, I remember having this thought. It seemed like a light bulb that just went off in my head, and I could not wait to go and talk to the professor about this. And so after class, I went up to the professor and I said, I think I'm really starting to get a sense of what's going on with this philosophy stuff. And I told him, I think really everything's just sort of relative. Everything's relative, right? There is no absolute moral truth. There is no absolute fundamental truth, right? Everything's relative. There is no absolute truth. I thought I was really going to impress my professor. And he said something to me that has always stuck with me. He asked me, "Do you believe that's true?" And I thought to myself, well, yeah, that's what I'm trying to say to you, right? Everything is relative. There is no absolute truth. And he said, all right, well, let's examine that proposition. There is no absolute truth. And he asked me again, do you believe that statement is true? And I had to think about it for a minute. What is the statement saying? The statement's saying every single statement out there is either false or relative or whatever. None of them are true. And then here I was saying, well, here's a statement that is true, right? There is no absolute truth. But if that's true, then there is at least one statement that's true. If this statement is true, then there is at least one statement that is true, right? And so if there's at least one statement that's true, that means this statement is false. So if this statement is true, then it's false. And that seems weird. That seems like a contradiction. The reason why I'm introducing this idea of how these sorts of statements are in some sense self-contradictory or self-undermining is because it introduces what's sometimes called the liar paradox. I think it's a good way to set the stage for this notion of a liar paradox, which I want to run through with you real quickly so you get a sense of why philosophers want to make sure their statements are as clear as possible. They want to make sure that we can symbolize our statements into symbolic forms such that we are not going to be leaving anything up to ambiguity or making anything that's self-contradictory like this. We want to avoid that when we're working through arguments. So let's take a look at that notion of a liar paradox. All right, so there's many different versions of the liar paradox. We just went through one a moment ago. I erased it from the board, but here's another very classic version of the liar paradox. It says, this statement is false. So let's think about this for a moment. The content of this statement is that it is false. So if we say that the statement itself is true, right? Let's just suppose for the moment that the truth value of the statement is true, that its content is true. Well, the content is that it's false. So that means if its content is true, then it is false. But we're just stipulating that it's true. So again, it looks like if the statement is true, then it's false. And if it's false, then we got a problem because we got a contradiction, right? We've got a sort of P and not P, right? This is the idea that the statement itself is in some sense self-undermining. It's sort of contradictory in some regards. And that poses a real big problem. Now, one of the reasons why these sorts of examples of the liar paradox are really, really instructive and helpful is because this sort of normal English statement refers to itself. It's got this property of being self-referential, right? It's like the proposition P can refer not to something else, but back around to itself. And that's a weird problem for normal, ordinary statements, ordinary English. Insofar as the statement can refer back to itself, then we can wind up in these sorts of liar paradoxes, these sort of puzzles where it looks like it's in some sense self-undermining or contradictory. And so this is a very important motivation. It's not the only, but it's one of the reasons why philosophers really want to try to really strip away the ambiguities. They want to find a way to make sure that everything is as clear as we possibly can, so we don't wind up in these sorts of puzzles and paradoxes that we get from ordinary English. So that's one of the reasons why for this next couple of modules, we're going to look at how we can symbolize, translate our ordinary English statements into symbolic form in order to make things as clear and as rigid as we possibly can. And you'll remember from last week's module, one of the things I asked you to do was to go and try to extract out from the passage what the argument was, right? But in that particular assignment, I did not ask you to put anything into symbolic form. I just asked you to identify what the conclusion was and what the premises were, and I asked you to try to put that into premise-conclusion form. Premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, so on and so forth. But you were left with still the ordinary English statements, right? The ordinary way of talking, you might say. So think back to last week when you were asked to extract this argument about why we should not fear death. Once you put it into premise-conclusion form, we are still left with some ambiguities, right? What exactly do we mean by death? Why should we understand death as annihilation or as non-existence? Why should we think that mere experience is just having perceptions and so forth? These are things that were left unexplained. They were sort of left up into interpretation, which means that there's lots of different ways that we can evaluate the argument and offer different objections to it, which is something that you practiced doing for the last week's module. Now we are going to be moving into a particular way of extracting the argument out from some passage, but then putting it into symbolic form. So that way we can take one more step in this pursuit of clarity and making the arguments and what we're trying to say, what we're trying to argue for, as clear as we possibly can. So that's the basis of what we're doing for this module and for next week as well.